these are ongoing eHeat webinars we're going to have to target different actually sectors and to target different technologies. So just to give you a very brief overview of eHeat. So like eHeat was established about 1.5 years ago, and it was really to focus on the industrial heat, decarbonising through electrification of industrial heat, because we really felt that it was a very good win for the country, and yet it was being not really represented compared to, let's say, some of the other technologies that are also important, hydrogen and AD and all these. But a real quick win for the next 10 years is electrification of industrial heat via predominantly heat pumps and that. So I'll just do a very quick overview of eHeat. I don't know, is that coming up there as a, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, so look, from a very high level, myself, I'm actually Tom Marren. I've been involved, and I work for a company called Astatine. Been involved in heat for about 30 years, both in Ireland, Australia, the Middle East, and that. So very much heat and power is my DNA. But so when we look at this, what we're putting forward, this is a 1.5 billion economic benefit to Ireland if we can electrify our industrial heat. And there's a number of areas then that this organisation is required to push government and get some policy changes as well to accelerate that. So the main goal of eHeat is the acceleration of electrification of heat. And why is it? It's a one-pager that I'll just very quickly go through. If we look at heat, there's the breakdown of our heat. It's 41 terawatt hours. It's probably slightly out of date from the latest information we have on that. So really, there's a lot of this below 200 degrees. There's a lot of technology that can electrify that extremely efficiency. So below 200, we got 9.4 terawatt hours, and that will give us a 16% renewable heat percentage. So currently, we're the lowest in Europe. So the idea is to bring us up. Also, it's a huge carbon reduction on that. If we look at the other high-level areas of this, then this would give us a huge carbon saving. It would also reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and these figures here are all based on 1.5 years ago. So that figure is a multiple of 4 or 5 now. But also, one of our indigenous energies is wind and renewables, and currently, that's being curtailed by about 2 terawatt hours a year. That's going to increase substantially as we bring more on. So we feel through kind of a flexible approach with electrification of heat, we can utilize probably about 80% of that current curtailment or congested power that's off, which, needless to say, is a huge economic benefit to the country and in the wind sector. It's also a very good economic benefit to the grid to get more charges because there's more electrical power going through. And then for the benefits of business, again, if we look at the cost of current fossil fuel, the cost of electricity and the economic actually savings. And again, all these figures are based on figures that are well out of date at the moment, but please God, they'll come back to that. So look, we really are on a practical approach, seeing paybacks of sub 3 years, even sub 1 years on large actually sites. So what we'd like to do, and especially in actually some of the sectors, and maybe some people covered area, but when we look at Europe and we look at the sectors, well, the food sector and the dairy sector is a main part of industrial heat pumps. It's been the main actually sector for adoption of this technology. So with that then, look, that's an overview. The association is important that it's strong, so we'd encourage anybody's on this to join the association, because we do need to lobby on a number of policy issues. One of them is charging. We feel the charges currently on the electrical grid should be reduced for eHeat customers, and because we don't need capacity and we don't need imperfections, so a lot of those charges, the government are in agreement with us, and so that's a policy to push that through. And then there's also issues about connectability, because what you will find is when you electrify your load, your MIC typically will double. So how do we address that? So with that then, look, I'll pass over to the other speakers, and at the end of this, then we'll have a Q&A we can answer all the questions from different speakers. All right. Now I'll just stop sharing here now and pass off to Fergal. There you go, Fergal.
Yeah, so I think I'm up first, haven't I, Tom? Yeah.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm Fergus Sharkey. I'm the head of business supports and transports. I see a lot of people I know on the call, including some of my colleagues, and the great Bob Hanna is there as well. It's great to see Bob still very interested in this. He's a stalwart of the game. I'm just going to cover a couple of things. Where do we stand? What does the data tell us? Talk about our heat study. What's the way forward? Tom touched on it a little bit there. What are some of the leaders out there doing? And then how can we support investments? So a lot of people are interested in grants, and we'll talk about the current status and some of the plans in that regard, So this is a snapshot of kind of the policy space, right? So these are our sectoral targets now and our emission ceilings. Now, I presented these as reductions, but of course they're not reductions anymore. They're budgets. So they're a maximum ceiling of emissions you can, but they're probably easier for most people to conceptualize as emissions. So there's enterprise, which is a reduction of 35%, public and commercial buildings, which is 45%, and electricity, which is this aggressive reduction of 75% on emissions. And that is that's the foundation of why electrification can be so strong for us, because you get the boost of the lower emission electricity plus the higher efficiency of heat pumps versus conventional heating systems. And there's some other targets around heating deployed in buildings and district heating uptake. So these are the kind of things that occupy my mind and my responsibilities and my programs. And there's a lot of policies in place already. There's the emissions trading scheme and a carbon tax. There's an obligation on energy suppliers to reduce end use, which is the Energy Efficiency Obligation Scheme. There's SEAI support, particularly our large industry network, our Exceed and SSRH grant. IDA and Enterprise Ireland are really stepping up their climate action support to their client companies over the last number of years. And that's great to see, and we're working very closely with them. There's building regulations, which sort of define that, they sort of, make sure you don't bake in some of these issues that we're going to have to solve. And there's a forthcoming renewable heat obligation scheme, which would probably drive things like biofuel blending and heating fuels and AD biogas in the natural gas network. And there's a lot of additional policy focus coming on, role of hydrogen and renewable gas, what all that means. I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. The long and the short of it is the emissions that comprise industry or business or enterprise or whatever way you want to talk about it are kind of across three pillars within the climate action plan. And a lot of it's heat, right? So you've got the industry pillar, which is about this 7 or 8 million tons. And most of that is heat. Some of it is F-gases, but most of it is combustion and heat. You've got buildings, which isn't a major factor, but it's about 1 million tons. And then you've got electricity demand, which is another 6 or so million tons on top of that. So they're the sectors and they're the responsible departments in terms of carbon budgets. And that block needs to look like the block on the right by 2030. And I suppose that's the area of my responsibility, and other agencies now, it's an all of government piece, but that's where we're really focusing on, and that's kind of the core of the subject today. In terms of what does SEAI think the way forward is, I suppose SEAI published a heat study earlier this year, which looked at 4 scenarios of the business as usual scenario. So it looked at decarbonised gas, high electrification, a little bit of both, and what can we do to really ramp this up, the rapid progress. And the rapid progress is probably the most aligned to our targets. I actually don't believe it achieves the targets from recollection. This was all published before some of these targets were set, but it is the most aligned to our targets. I suppose 2 key messages I'd pull from that. You can read from it. I think it's 9 reports. Some of them are sectoral, some of them, it's really, really interesting, high quality stuff, and it paints a picture and supports the policy direction. I suppose 2 big things I'd say today is that the pathways with the lowest cumulative emissions, remember we're in carbon budget, cumulative emissions are really important now, use more electric heating technologies. And the scenarios that focus on hydrogen gas grid have more cumulative emissions. This is broadly because that's a technology that doesn't come as quickly towards 2050. Electrification is available now. It's economic now. It's attractive now.
Hi,
possible now.
hi. It's going. I'm just listening to something.
Could
Sorry, yeah, sorry.
Could somebody mute there if you don't mind? And then the other thing I'd say is electricity plays a major role. We've got heat pumps and electric techs, and you can kind of see that as interchangeable. Some heat pumps, you know, are already providing medium low grade heat, and a lot of people will expect that medium grade heat above 150 is going to be very possible within this decade. So there's a significant amount of electrification of heat possible in industrial heating demand, which is obviously the core of this subject today. And so what do we, you know, that's the sort of mapping it out and trying to figure out the way forward. What are we working with the key energy users with right now? Well, what are we telling them? We're telling them that if they want to decarbonize rapidly by 2030, and many corporates do, that this is the toolbox, and energy efficiency being the underpinning piece. Energy efficiency has saved more emissions than any renewable technology, any other technology that's out there globally to date. So energy efficiency is the workhorse. Don't forget about it. Reduce demand. It makes it a lot easier to do the rest. And then there's electrification, which comes in tandem with renewable electricity. So electrification of heat via heat pumps is extremely efficient. And renewable electricity to drive down those emissions, either from the grid, purchasing your own, or generating your own. That's the way you can get there. It is absolutely just with those three building blocks: efficiency, electrification, and renewable electricity. If somebody says to me, that's my plan to reduce my emissions by 2030, and that's what the plan is, it's credible, it's achievable, it makes sense, it stacks up. Everything else carries a lot more kind of risk and uncertainty. Biomass is obviously a piece of the picture as well. Towards 2030, we have a very good indigenous resource that is underutilized. It's not being affected, you know, particularly wood chip, by recent price hikes because it's indigenous. It's only really connected to maybe transport costs and labor costs within Ireland. That's an opportunity, but it's, you know, it's an opportunity that has its place, and we're obviously driving that out through the SSRH. And then we're going to need all the rest. This isn't to say that biogas and hydrogen and all the other stuff isn't going to be required, CCS, for example, but really that's a post-2030 play. They require entire new regulatory systems, in some cases entirely new infrastructure. And that's not going to happen overnight. So we got to get the policy platform right, and then we got to grow those industries. But really what's on the left is what we talk to our clients about and what we drive. I bring up Arrivo as a case study. We've supported, I was trying to do a bit of a kind of we probably supported of the order of about 30 to 50 heat electrification projects in industry. So obviously we've supported a load in buildings, but in industry, heat electrification projects, and the vast majority of those have been heat pumps. I call out Arrivo because these are one of the first companies, obviously because it's dairy, so it's very pertinent to today's discussion. But I'd call them out. These were one of the first guys to go with it. They went in 2015 and looked at this as an opportunity, and they delivered that opportunity in 2016. We supported it, and it's certified under the Exceed project. It generates 80-degree hot water, and it's saving them, or was saving them, €350,000 annually. I imagine that's increased in recent years. It's reduced emissions 80% from that process, 780 tons, and an 85% reduction in oil use in that process. So they still use oil within the process for startup and for backup and so on. There's a case study on our website, but we did this in 2016 before I joined SEAI actually, and there was really, you know, we really thought it was going to be a watershed moment for the industry and that was going to be adopted widespread. That hasn't really happened, but it does feel like in the last 12 or 18 months, there is a big push forward with a lot of people who are looking at this in a much more major way. And Tom talked about the demand that they're seeing out there, and I'm seeing that as well. I'm just going to finish up because very quick on SEAI supports. I could talk about these at length, obviously, but in terms of what we're talking about today, which is heat pumps in industry, there are 3 capital supports available from SEAI that can support and do support that type of activity. There are community energy grants. And that's for a wide range of technologies, but there is a requirement to demonstrate a community benefit or community gain within that. Typically 30%, and there's a maximum of 5 million per group of projects. So these are community of projects, which would be domestic and business and public sector and not-for-profit that come through those schemes. But it's worth looking at. It's definitely an avenue, and it's probably, you know, from a capital perspective where we're supporting most businesses is through that scheme. We've the Exceed scheme, which is really for a comprehensive energy upgrade, not just a heat pump only, although it can support that if that's what comes through the process. But it does sort of benefit the business by supporting the design effort and following an energy efficiency design process. And there's capital support for that stage. And then there's support for obviously the investment, and that's 30 to 50% and a maximum of 1 million. It's a very impactful scheme, and we've seen a number of large industry players use that for electrification projects. There's some changes in the pipeline on that scheme that will further enhance its suitability for large investments, particularly, that hopefully will be announced in the coming months. They're in the system, as they say. And the support scheme for renewable heat, which is predominantly supported biomass, but is a support for heat pumps as well. And there's been some limitations on the heat pump side, particularly when it comes to industrial heat pumps, which we expect to change in the coming weeks. Again, it's in the system. I was hoping when this was put in the diary, whenever I think David wrote to me, I thought I was going to be able to speak about it today, but I can't quite yet. But there are some significant changes coming down the track in that scheme. That's a 15-year tariff for biomass, and you can get up to 3.5 million over 15 years. It's a real no-brainer if somebody has the space and the ability to operate a biomass system to change over to biomass at the moment. I mean, really attractive. The grant for heat pumps is 30% up to a maximum of 1 million. We've done a few buildings, and we've done a few process type applications, but most of it's come through Exceed and community energy grants to date. And we're going to make some changes on the SSRH from the heat pump side, which we expect it will be a much more suitable and applicable support. So that's really it. That's a whistle-stop tour. I hope I didn't go over too much time. And obviously, I presume we're taking Q&A at the end, so I'm around until such time as that happens. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Fergus. Yeah, we will be doing Q&A at the end. Okay, so who's up next?
I think that's me.
Great.
So if I just share my screen there, you might just let me know that you can all see it okay.
Yeah, see it. Yeah.
Yep. Stuff. So my name is Cian Kearns, and I work as a policy analyst in the Climate Action and Economic Infrastructure Unit here in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So I suppose I'm just giving a short little chat today, just trying to fill the gap there between Fergus and his kind of broader breakdown, and Aileen, who I think is going to talk a little bit more to specific supports later. So I'll just start by talking a little bit about enterprise policy and how climate policy is informed from both international and national policies. A little bit of the sectoral emission ceilings that I know Fergus has touched on as well, and what we see these meaning for manufacturing and combustion. And I'm going to, I suppose, mention some of the challenges that we foresee and some of the opportunities that are there as well. So enterprise policy is driven by a range of topic papers. These come out in multiple years they come out, but there was a real shift in enterprise policy in maybe 2018, 2019. So there was more of a concerted effort looking at the digital economy and to prepare for the green transition in business. So Enterprise 2025 was published in 2015, but was actually reviewed in 2018. That was aimed at building more resilience into the Irish economy, especially in the face of challenges at the time. A key one there was Brexit. We had the Future Jobs Ireland looked at ways to kind of embrace skills and develop the talent that would be feed into this low carbon economy, kind of recognising that these were areas for potential future growth. We had the Economic Recovery Plan in 2021, and this was to promote job creation and economic growth post-pandemic. And then, of course, we have the upcoming Enterprise White Paper, and that's going to sort of determine strategy for enterprise going forward for the next decade or more, to 2030 and beyond. So part of the difficulty in this paper, what's being hammered out now, is trying to figure out how we're going to align enterprise policy and climate change, because up until now, enterprise policy has been mostly focused on growth, economic growth, jobs, one of the key metrics. But now, of course, there's climate aspects as well. We've got to look at carbon emissions. So how do we carry those two slightly diverging demands? So I suppose, where does this climate agenda stem from. Some of it is coming from international policy. Of course, we've got the EU Green Deal, which is the EU has set a binding target of achieving climate neutrality by 2050 throughout the EU. And as an intermediate step, they want to cut emissions by 55% by 2030. So this is in European climate law. So there's a number of packages that feed in under the EU Green Deal. I suppose the biggest suite of packages is the Fit for 55 package. And this is a set of some new legislation and it's revisions of existing legislation aimed at ensuring that the EU policies are in line with climate goals that the EU holds. And then you've got things like the Circular Economy Action Plan, which is tied very closely to the EU Green Deal, and that looks at how products are designed, and it's trying to promote circular economy processes. It's encouraging sustainable consumption, looking at things like preventing waste as well, and keeping resources in use and in circulation as long as possible. There's the Eco Design Directive as well. It's going to be looking at products. That's underway too, looking at kind of technical standards for products and making sure that they can be both monitored, tracked to them and easily repaired. And of course, the farm to fork strategy, which people here might be familiar with as well, it's kind of trying to reduce the environmental and climate impact of primary production while also ensuring a fair economic return for farmers. Of course, it's not just regulation. I mean, there's market forces as well, kind of pushing this drive towards increased climate action. There's changing customer preferences, of course, and then there's the prominence of environment, social governance, bigger firms looking for their suppliers to be matching their own ambitions. So on a national level, our climate policy has been driven by the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Act 2021, which is the Climate Act it's normally referred to. This has reduction of 51% by 2030 with net zero by 2050. And this is going to be delivered through 5-year carbon budgets, as Fergus mentioned. There's a sectoral emission ceilings as part of that. So the 5-year carbon budgets is the amount that we can emit as a country as a whole. And then the sectoral emission ceilings break those down by different sectors of the economy, and they put like a hard limit or a budget on how much each sector of the economy can use. And of course, the climate action plans, the annual climate action plans, the new one is under development at the moment. They're kind of the vehicle by which we're going to achieve these savings. So looking at industry specifically, I think as Fergus alluded to, in 2018, we emitted about 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent in the industry sector. So the industry sector, although in 2018 it actually did it was F gases and manufacturing combustion and industrial processes. Now, going forward, it'll just be manufacturing combustion and industrial processes, I believe, that will at least fall to Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. But like I said, in 2018, it was around 7 million tons of emissions in those sectors, manufacturing combustion and industrial processes. In 2021, about the same. By 2025, we're looking for a decrease of 20%, so that would be in around 6 million tons. Of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted. And then by 2030, we're trying to reduce to minus 35% against the baseline year in 2018. So you can see that that's quite a serious step up in ambition, and we have a bit of a ways to go to reach that. Looking, I suppose, again, from industry, as I said, we are kind of broken into two different sectors. We have the manufacturing combustion and we have the industrial processes. Industrial process emissions come from things like if you're making cement. In the manufacturing process of cement, you're actually releasing emissions. These are chemical emissions that come through the process of making cement. What we see as policies that there isn't a whole lot that can be done to reduce industrial process emissions in the next couple of years. So there'll be things like carbon capture and storage, hopefully in the future. There might be doing things. We might be trying to reduce our amount of embodied carbon in cement, but where we see the most gains happening is manufacturing combustion, at least for the next couple of years. I think Fergus did mention the various pathways, and then for us, electrification is kind of key because that's the one where we see the most amount of gains getting to 2030, and we already have our hard targets for 2030. So looking specifically at manufacturing combustion, we have kind of a breakdown, two charts you can see here on the left and right. On the left, we have food and beverages. So it's been fairly steady. It's the kind of grey bar right in the middle of the bigger bars with the grey colour. Been fairly steady, around 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions each year. And what we'd like to see, of course, is this reduce. And things like heat pumps in particular, as they're introduced, we should hopefully see these emissions falling, and that grey bar would get narrower and narrower. But as you can also see over kind of roughly the same timeline here on the right, the manufacturing combustion electricity, I won't talk to that because I'm not sure if that was correctly included or not. In the next section, you can just see, just as a note, if we break down the highest emitting fuel cohorts by sector, you can see that the food, beverages, and tobacco, which is included in that sector as well, their gas use is one of the highest across manufacturing combustion for emissions produced. Natural gas is obviously challenging to, I suppose policy previously had been maybe to encourage people toward natural gas, as it is a cleaner fuel source than some of the other fuels that are out there. But now we're looking for electrification. So that's part of one of the challenges, is trying to figure out how do we encourage businesses to aim for electrification now rather than natural gas. Of course, in these days with the skyrocketing prices of natural gas, that's very much in flux at the moment. So I suppose talking some of the challenges we see from a policy perspective, I mean, a big one is that economic and population expansion is that the labour force is predicted to increase by 10% from 2020 to 2030. So that's an awful lot more people are coming in looking for jobs, and generally increased jobs means increased emissions. There's, of course, the economic capacity. Can the economy carry the cost of the changes that are required? I mean, we are post-pandemic, of course, there's inflation at the moment, war in Ukraine. That also ties in with supply chain constraints. There's bottlenecks for key materials, things like solar panels. We see energy infrastructure capacity, and that is definitely being worked at a lot at the moment, but making sure that the grid capacity is there to meet the electrification objectives that we have. And then there's technological viability, things like carbon capture and storage. When is that going to be viable for us to use? And locked in capital investment. Obviously, if people are investing in a gas boiler tomorrow, they're not going to want to 10, 15 or more years. So how do we introduce policy that encourages people to electrify now rather than choosing one of the other options that are available? There are opportunities as well. There's energy efficiency savings, and that's a big one. And obviously with heat pumps, that's one of the primary draws to it. And then more generally, I mean, you know, with green production, you can have product differentiation. It appeals to corporate social responsibility and through staff retention. People are very much in favour of the green economy at the moment. And agency programs and climate appraisal models. So if you're applying for funding to a lot of the agency programs, you'll generally go through an economic appraisal model, but they're shortly to be introducing a climate appraisal model, or that'll be tied in with the economic appraisal model. So you'll have to show that new projects actually can reduce emissions. So they're either carbon neutral or they're reducing emissions. And I suppose my final slide is just to shout out to the Climate Toolkit for Business. So this was launched last year. It's worthwhile for smaller businesses. You can log in, you input details on your waste, your energy use, a variety of other factors, but they're quite simple. You generally have them in bills. It'll then give you a tailored list of different funding and support that's available for you and for your business, and that's definitely something we'd recommend that people check out. And that's all for me. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Cian. That was very clear. I'd like to welcome now Eileen, who's a Senior Development Advisor with Enterprise Ireland. Okay, Eileen.
Thanks, Tom. I'll just start sharing my screen there and hopefully you'll be able to see it. Can you see that?
Not yet.
There. I know.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Great. Okay, I'll just put it in slide deck mode. So thanks, Tom, and thanks to the eHeat team for giving me the opportunity to speak today to you. And I think, you know, just the preceding slides and presentations by Fergus and Cian, it's a nice introduction to myself, and just in terms of Enterprise Ireland and our supports there around the climate side of things. So as Tom mentioned, I'm a senior advisor with Enterprise Ireland. I'm now in what's called the Climate Sustainability and Ag Tech Department or unit within EI, which was formed earlier in the year. For today's discussion, I suppose we're going to just talk about specifically what our green funds are. They're under the Enterprise Ireland has what's called we have an umbrella fund called the Green Transition Fund. And I suppose under the Climate Action Plan 2021, which was already mentioned there, enterprise, ourselves, IDA, would have a number of targets and deliverables to achieve under the Climate Action Plan. So to help companies and our Irish client companies to decarbonise. So we have this Green Transition Fund, and it's part of the National Recovery and Resilience Fund, our plan, and it's funded by the EU. And it's as I said, it's really there to encourage the decarbonisation of Irish enterprise. Under the umbrella of the Green Transition Fund of Enterprise Ireland, we have two specific funds. One is the Climate Planning Fund for Business, which has been around for the last year or two, which I'll talk about. And then a new fund, which I have been tasked with leading out on in Enterprise Ireland, is a brand new fund called the Enterprise Emissions Reduction and Investment Fund. A bit of a mouthful, but essentially it is around focusing on manufacturing companies on their manufacturing combustion process and helping them to decarbonise that way and move away from fossil fuels. So look, I'll touch on the Climate Planning Fund for Business, but maybe try and lean more on the presentation or my slides on the Enterprise Emissions Reduction Fund. But just I suppose when we talk about our fund around climate planning, it's exactly that. So, this fund, it's very much to help companies on their kind of decarbonisation journey, and really to start them thinking about, well, putting a sustainability type plan or a decarbonisation type plan in place for their business. Also looking at embedding the kind of skills and the knowledge capability around sustainability within their own team so they can drive future sustainability for their business. So under the Climate Planning Fund for Business, there are 4 specific funding offers, which you might be familiar about, but I'll just touch on them anyway. The Climate Action Voucher, it's a €1,800 grant there to bring in a consultant to work with you as a company on your sustainability, decarbonisation or circular economy journey. The Green Start then is that kind of level up. It's a 5,000 grant support to start introducing kind of environmental best practice systems and frameworks into a business. And then the next tier up from that is a larger fund, our Green Plus, which is 50% training support for companies. And it's really, I suppose, helping companies to now start, aligning with those international best practice standards, targets, sustainability frameworks, SBTI, that sort of thing, and really drive kind of more long-term environmental efficiency and sustainability within their business. One of the new funds, which was just launched under the Climate Planning Fund, which may be of interest to a number of the companies, it's strategic consultancy for large companies. Normally, Enterprise Ireland would not be able to offer strategic consultancy support to large enterprise because it would have come out of our de minimis budget. But under this fund, we can offer consultancy support to help companies develop a carbon reduction fund. Just on the Climate Planning Fund, as I said, it's coming out of the Recovery and Resilience Fund. It's 25 million of a fund run over this year to 2025, and we've got a 5 million budget for this year, and similar then budgets until 2025. So it's just a couple of slides there on the different funding offers under the Climate Planning Fund. As I said, the voucher there, €1,800 grant, and we're seeing companies coming in looking to do planning around their whole sustainability, decarbonisation, or actually start looking at implementing and developing a circular economy action plan. So it's a small level of support. It's, works out at 2 days consultancy at a kind of standard rate of €900. It's a short-term type offer over a 6-week period, and it's available to our startup companies, our HPSUs, they're called, SME and large client companies. State aid, it's coming out of de minimis budget. And there, I won't go through that, but that just gives you a sense of the different type of activities we see coming in from client companies who are looking to draw down a climate action voucher application. So, okay, on the Green Start, as I said, that's the kind of next step up. The grant support is at 80%, and total kind of project costs are at 6,300. And again, that's kind of training and advisory costs, often consultancy led, and it's a longer term. It's, you know, typically over a 6 to 12 month period, again, open to the same type of client companies. What we do have for both the Green Start and the Green Plus, our green team have developed over recent years a kind of database of green service providers. So that's available to our client companies. You know, if you want to start looking at sustainability, or and you don't have the capability in-house, we do have a list of kind of green service providers that we can provide to our companies. State aid coming out de minimis here. So I suppose this just gives a kind of a flavour of the type of applications and the activities that companies are looking for support under the Green Start. So around, you know, in recent years, in the last year actually, carbon footprinting has become a big one. Companies wanting to develop a carbon reduction roadmap, metering roadmap as well. We're seeing interest there. And then, you know, ones that have companies have always been looking at is around the kind of sustainability in terms of packaging, logistics, green procurement and tenders, that whole kind of sustainability kind of strategy and the alignment with the best practice frameworks and initiatives. The Green Plus, as I said, that's the kind of the next step beyond the Green Start. So often companies will have done the Green Start and then, you know, they're becoming more ambitious in terms of what their plans and targets are. So this Green Plus would be, it's at a 50% grant level, and project costs are up to a maximum of 100,000. Again, kind of consultancy and training and advisory type support. And here, unlike the Green Start, what we're trying to do here is actually kind of embed the capability and that kind of knowledge transfer from the consultant into the kind of internal project champion teams within the company. So to try and upskill them in the whole area of sustainability and decarbonisation. So we do, under this Green Plus, allow for salary costs of up to 10 project staff members there. And then if there's specific training course fees that a company wants their staff to attend to, we can look at that. That's a larger time frame. It typically runs from between 12 to 18 months. It's available to our established companies, so our small companies and our large companies, not really to our startup companies. And again, you can access the green service provider if you do not have your own consultant that you can work with. And the state aid here is under GBER. And there on the right side of the slide deck there, it just gives a flavour of the type of applications and what companies are looking for there. So again, similar to the Green Start, but at a kind of more ambitious and more detailed level would be around the whole carbon footprinting, the life cycle assessment, and then on the packaging and logistics. Plastic management is obviously a big one as well for companies. Okay, as I said, under the Climate Planning Fund for Business, this strategic consultancy is a brand new one that we're offering to clients this year. And I suppose we're just hearing back, and it was kind of led by our development advisors, hearing back from their client companies. So, and you know, it's quite limited in terms of the eligible activity is very much around developing an organisation-wide carbon reduction roadmap. So not for, you know, any kind of general business strategy type support. It is very much support to help a company develop that carbon reduction roadmap. So it is open for large and small companies, and really targeting those companies that have a high energy usage. For companies that don't have a higher energy usage, or at a kind of at a more immature stage of their green journey, we would be saying to them to we would be signposting them more to our Green Start rather than this strategic consultancy measure. Again, consultancy led, so it's they're the costs that are covered, and it's under de minimis or environmental aid guidelines. Okay, and I suppose just with all our funding offers, all the details of these funds and the Enterprise Emissions Fund that I'm going to talk about now, they're all up on our corporate website. So I'd be directing you to go there for more information or talk to your development advisor. Okay, one thing I would say, and just for companies to be aware of, if you are working with Enterprise Ireland, we are now in a lot of our application forms, we've inserted a new question that we are asking companies to complete, and that's really about what their carbon footprint is. We're starting to capture that for our companies, so you will see a lot more of that. Cian mentioned there the climate toolkit. So again, just drawing your attention there, that is a good starting point to, if companies aren't aware of their footprint, to use that tool. And I suppose the good thing about this, or another good thing about this toolkit, is, like Cian was saying, you know, it'll calculate your footprint, but it will also then signpost you to the different supports that are out there through the likes of SEAI, through ourselves or IDA. So you know, it's very relevant and suitable for client companies. Okay, so the second fund that I just want to spend the last couple of moments on is, as I said, it's a new fund that we launched, I think, in June this year. It seems a lot longer, but it's called the Enterprise Emissions Reduction Investment Fund. So apologies, it is a bit of a mouthful, but that's the name that has landed. And I suppose it, you know, it ties in with the previous speakers here. The fund is to support companies move away from fossil fuel carbon emitting technologies to the kind of cleaner carbon abatement technologies. It's under the Recovery and Resilience Facility coming from European funding, and we have a number of kind of two key metrics there that we need to achieve under this fund, and that's to achieve 250,000 tonnes of a CO2 reduction by 2030, and we also have a target of to support about 750 companies under this fund. Eligible companies, it's EI and IDA companies, so SME and large companies. We are, you know, because of the metrics that are there, you'll see the 250, we are trying to target companies that do have a large carbon footprint, and when they're making an application here, they need to show that this investment is actually going to significantly reduce their carbon footprint. Just in terms of the funding tracks, and I'll spend more time on track one, but the first two tracks are kind of, it is essentially a capital grant support for companies. The third track, which I won't really talk too much about, you know, that's research and development, and that's really where, you know, again, you'd be aware of Enterprise Ireland has a lot of R&D funding offers for companies. So if companies want to undertake R&D to develop low carbon or sustainability type products, services or business models, then we would be encouraging them to just avail of our existing R&D supports there. So in terms of the capital grant support, there's, as I said, two funding tracks here. You have your the larger, what I'm calling track one capital grant, to move away from you know, your oil or your gas boiler into your cleaner type technologies, your heat pump type solutions. And then the second funding track, and again, it ties down with you know, research that we're seeing from industry and just hearing from companies, is that a lot of our companies haven't been taking account of their carbon footprint. They don't know what it is. So, I mean, the first step there is really to kind of invest in kind of energy metering and tracking systems. So that's the second offer there. Under the Enterprise Emissions Fund, it's a 30 million fund, similar run from now to 2025. The budget is of 30 million is shared equally between ourselves and IDA. So, I mean, it is limited in terms of the budget, but we'll work with what we have. And what I would say, the evaluation process for any companies who have worked with Enterprise Ireland in terms of previous capital support schemes, it's a, you know, standard application and assessment processes apply here. There's nothing new here. This scheme will be run using those existing processes. So as I said, focus on track one, supporting companies to move from fossil fuel to cleaner, and specifically in the manufacturing combustion process at plant level, really targeting the manufacturing type companies, the companies with the kind of the larger carbon footprint. Here in the middle there, just in terms of the technologies that are eligible, industrial heat pumps, electric steam boilers, heat recovery, and biomass boilers with an asterisk. And I suppose there, you know, we're saying we will, and mindful that, you know, SEAI have an offer here, and you know, we have been working with SEAI. I think Fergus mentioned it there in terms of developing out this fund. So SEAI do have an offer there that Fergus spoke about their support with biomass. So what we're providing here is we look at ETS type companies if they are looking to make an investment there. In terms of the grant support, minimum grant there is 20,000 up to $1 million, and the grant percentage varies between 30 to 50% depending on what the company size is. So if it's 50% up to a small company and 30% for a larger company. Sorry. And what I would say is it's grant support based on eligible costs. And when we talk about eligible costs, it's the extra investment to go beyond the EU standard to achieve that higher rate of energy efficiency. So it'll be the 30 or 50% of, or 40% if you're a medium company, of the eligible costs. As I said, you know, it's our standard application and assessment process. So that would entail, if most companies would have a development advisor, a technologist or technical assessor that they work with on previous applications. So again, you would just discuss the application with that team prior to submission. What we do look for is prior to any application and to a company, that the company would undertake some sort of assessment. And that really is to determine that both the site and what is being proposed in terms of the capital investment is suitable. Sorry, the phone is ringing there, of course. What I'd say, full details of the application and the whole assessment process is available on our website, and I'll provide the links there. I think it's the last slide I have. So you'll see there. So prior to application, a pre-assessment is required in terms of suitability, and we do look for post-approval an M&V, a measurement and verification report is done, and that's really about, as I said, you know, there is a key metric about reducing carbon emissions. So we do look for this M&V to show that, you know, has the CO2 that was being targeted, has that reduction been realised? So what I would flag is that for any companies looking at this fund, to spend a bit of time and ensure that what they are putting in as targets, that they are achievable, because it will be looked at post the project. I think Cian touched on it, and I think, you know, similarly in Enterprise Ireland, we would have kind of our standard value for money measures that, you know, when we are looking at applications, we're seeing what the uplift is in terms of sales, employment, and exports. Here, I suppose what we are trying to, you know, align, you know, our kind of standard enterprise targets, those traditional enterprise targets around the value for money with kind of more the environmental targets. So we have in this regard for this fund is to we have set kind of specific evaluation criteria around, well, what is the company's current environmental strategy, what's being proposed here in terms of, you know, the strategy, what will be the reduction in CO2 emissions, what other environmental benefits there are there, and then, you know, similar value for money, or how we evaluate projects is, well, what's the need for funding, and then the financial robustness of the company itself. Track 2, as I said, it's, you know, for metering, and often we see companies will have started to maybe start looking at their carbon footprint and taking account of it, or they're seeing there are gaps there, and how they want to maybe address those gaps is actually start, you know, capturing and metering what their carbon footprint, what the emissions, what their energy emissions are. So this is a smaller capital grant support for companies to put in place the monitoring and targeting tracking systems to start taking account of their carbon footprint. So it's towards the hardware costs, I should say, rather than the software costs for those systems. Grant support minimum.
If I could just push you on a little bit there, Eileen, because we're going to run out of time.
Okay,
otherwise.
sorry. Yeah.
We're only 7 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. I think I'm nearing it anyway,
Yeah.
Tom. So that's it. And look, all the details for all the funds are up online anyway. One thing I will flag, and again, you know, similar to asking the questions around carbon footprint, we are starting to look at the do no significant harm principles, which again, you will be seeing a lot more of. And it's just a flag that when companies are applying for a number of these funds under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we will be asking them to complete this compliance with do no significant harm. So the 6 environmental objectives there under that do no significant harm are there for you to look at. But again, come back and talk to ourselves, because we have kind of prompts there to help companies. I won't touch on that because that's just really about a green, if a company is embarking on a green journey, what it should look like. And there you go. That's my last slide. Just in terms of all the details, it's up on our corporate site. So, so apologies for rushing there and taking a bit more time. So, but happy to do a Q&A or if there's any questions there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And look, it's great to see EI so on board and supporting this. So I'll pass over to David now because we're really down on time.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. So my name is David Connolly. I'm the Chief Technology Officer with Astatine. So I suppose the part that I'll cover is how we're experiencing delivering some of these projects on the kind of ground, you could say, day to day, especially with some of the dairy clients that we're working with. So just very briefly about Astatine, our main focus and our unique selling point is very much the high temperature heat pumps that we provide. So we do heat pumps up to 200 degrees, but I put the 200 degrees in bracket just to distinguish, because once you pass the 130 degrees, you probably turn to a more bespoke, larger scale technology. Below the 130, it's very much mainstream, commoditized, very wide range of capacities that's available. So you have an awful lot more options up to about the 130 degrees right now. But I would say the industry, if you're at any of the kind of industrial heat pump events these days, you know, the mood music is very much that they're pushing that temperature up all the time for the more standardized products. So I'd say by the end of this decade, we'll be very much looking at the 200 degrees as a commonplace solution. So I think that's where the industry is evolving out of. When we go into clients and we're electrifying their heat with industrial heat pumps, as you can imagine, there's a huge interest then in decarbonising their electricity, which is then their main heat source. So we also do ground-mounted and rooftop solar installations along with batteries to try and maximise how much green electricity they can use as well, mainly just due to the complementary nature of it. So we've put in facilities from 100 kilowatts to 5,000 kilowatts on the solar front, from rooftop to ground-mounted, to complement the heat pump side of things. And just a final note is that we fund projects for our clients where we offer the solar and the heat as a service, or we also do the traditional client pays for the project up front and we just deliver it as a turnkey. But this slide, I'm very much going to focus on our kind of unique selling point of the high temperature heat pumps and how that's applicable particularly to the dairy sector and the wider food and beverage sector. At the moment, just a sample of the type of projects, we have about 6 dairy projects that we're working on, which are listed there on the right hand side. Most of those are looking to get heat at about 80 to 100 degrees from a heat pump. And we're typically finding that we can replace 50 to 70% of their load on a site by supplying those sort of temperature levels. I suppose I put in another one just listed there on the left-hand side about a distillery that we're hoping to have go live at the start of next year. You might have heard Fergus and Tom chatting about it if you were here at the early stages of the webinar before we started. But I just mentioned it because that's supplying 115 degree hot water. So just in terms, it'll be the first industrial heat pump in Ireland, I believe, that'll be over 100 degrees as a supply temperature. And I suppose just to give people a flavour of how soon we'll have this technology here in Ireland and how available and readily available it is, and how it can be used in sectors like dairy to go to those higher temperature levels if needed. What we're seeing on the dairy front and wider projects when we're on sites at the moment is on the solar front, there's over a 50% reduction in electricity costs at the moment, and the paybacks are 3 or 4 years. So there's really good paybacks. It can depend a lot on operating hours and site conditions, of course, but there's definitely in the last couple of months, the solar front has transformed with the escalating prices of electricity. And I suppose the reason I'm just saying that is maybe 12 months ago, solar was seen as a way to help decarbonize your electricity and your electrified heat. right now solar is very much seen as a way to help reduce the cost of decarbonising your electrified heat. So it's not no longer just a kind of, let's say, science-based targets initiative to try and decarbonize, but it's very much part of the business case. And then on the solar front, you're usually getting about 30% of your electricity supplied, but again, that's very dependent on the specific site. It's just more to give people kind of flavors of what's typically possible. On the heat pump side, again, it's around a 50% reduction in cost that we're seeing at the moment. I think the key thing to flag there is, of course, many people are nervous about the increase in costs of electricity for the heat pumps, but in parallel to increasing costs of electricity, there's also been huge increases in the price of fuel, particularly natural gas. So I think it's the ratio between electricity to fuel, which is really the key driver of the savings for a heat pump. So even though we've had a high increase in prices with electricity, as fuel prices have increased in parallel, the savings have still been there for many projects. I would say that there's just a lot of uncertainty right now. So any kind of policy measure which can provide certainty around the ratio between electricity to fuel prices would certainly accelerate things a lot further when it comes to the industrial heat pump side of things. And then on the carbon front, it's usually about a 70% or more reduction in carbon for the portion of heat that you can replace with the heat pump. So the short version of all of this is just to give people a sense of, yes, there's a decarbonisation agenda here, but there's absolutely a business case behind a lot of these decisions, even before the last 3 or 4 months, and especially now with the way that fuel prices have gone. Just in terms of getting into specific projects, when we go on a site, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for places, low temperature heat that the heat pump can use as a source. So on dairy facilities, this would typically be 30 to 50 degrees waste heat that's not being used. And we're looking for places to use that waste heat on those sites to replace oil or gas that's currently being used by a boiler. So when we go on a site initially, we're doing an assessment to see, well, what kind of sources do you have around your facility? Is there chillers, refrigeration plants, cooling towers where we could use those low temperature heat sources? And what kind of uses do you have for the heat that you need? So what kind of temperature levels do you need? And what kind of volumes of heat do you need at those various temperature levels? And for us then, the task is designing a heat pump, which I would say is it's a much more tricky task than a boiler. You know, a boiler is a much more kind of generic piece of technology. A heat pump needs a lot more engineering and design work, which, you know, means it requires a lot more knowledge and expertise, which is maybe one of the reasons it has been slow to come to Ireland until recently. But it does certainly need a degree of, let's say, engineering expertise to design a bespoke system for that site. And once you do that, then you can see how to get the maximum efficiency depending on what sources and sinks that you have on that particular site. I would say on the dairy facilities, these are very typical of the sources and sinks that we find. So on the sources, we find things like chillers, cooling towers, vacuum pumps, air compressors, water treatment plants, and then we quantify what kind of amount of heat we can absorb from those different sources. And then on the heat sink side, we're looking at things like boiler feed water, CIPs for their cleaning, hot water systems, drying, so we can preheat air for drying, pasteurizers, and any other uses of water up to about 120, 130 degrees that we can find on site. And with a client, we usually go through this mapping exercise, and based on this, we design a heat pump system to suit. Where the money then is coming from is this jigsaw, and I think anyone can nearly have a look at this jigsaw based on their own specific circumstances. So at the top, you basically look at the current heating system, and on the bottom, you look at the alternative for a heat pump system. So if you just look at, like, anyone can probably take out their recent bills and have a look at how this matrix would look for their particular site. But we're looking at what's your current fuel rate. So let's say in this particular case, we have a fuel rate of 8 cents a kilowatt hour. I'm sure many of you are thinking we'd love to have a fuel rate of 8 cents a kilowatt hour right now. So it's probably something much north of that if you're looking at a bill from the last month or two. What's the efficiency of your boiler and steam system? So not just the boiler producing the steam, but then distributing the steam around the plant. And using that efficiency, so dividing your fuel rate by your efficiency, you get a heat rate. So in this example, it was just under 11 cents a kilowatt hour. And if you do a comparison on the heat pump side, you can look at your electricity rate and then look at a typical heat pump efficiency on a dairy site is usually more than 4. So if you take it as a typical example that you're getting a COP of 4, divide your electricity rate by that COP of 4, and you'd get the new heat rate that you'd have with a heat pump. So you can see in this particular example, based on this client's fuel rates, they had a heat rate that was about half with the heat pump compared to what it was with fossil fuels. Now, that's the driver of the economic savings, but of course, those savings then have to pay for the capex that funds the project up front. So I suppose if you just took a typical, a large scale dairy facility might have a 3 megawatt heat load running at 6,000 hours a year. With these kind of savings, they'd be saving over $1 million a year. And that $1 million a year saving has to then justify the upfront costs that goes to not just paying for the heat pump, but paying for the integration costs of putting in the heat pump. So, this is a very typical scenario I'd say we would see when we go on to a site. We have a 3 megawatt heat load, 6,000 hours, a COP of 4, so they can save $1 million a year. And then if we take advantage of the various supports that are mentioned by both Fergus and Aileen, we can usually look to try and pitch something of around a 3-year payback, depending on for the good sites that have all those conditions that meet those criteria. So by circulating this low-grade heat through a heat pump to produce high-grade heat that goes back into the facility. So we're using a waste heat stream out of the facility, powered by electricity from either the grid or solar. And with these conditions, we can usually get those very, very appealing payback periods. I'm conscious time is tight, so I think the last thing I'll just touch on is just to emphasize how well established the technology is. So yes, it's very new in Ireland, but it's not very new around Europe. So this is just an example from the International Energy Agency of 340 industrial heat pump installations across Europe. There's about 20,000 a year, so they're very, very common in mainland Europe. But in that study by the International Energy Agency, the most common sector that industrial heat pumps were put into was the food and beverage sector. And the food and beverage sector is the largest industrial user of energy in Ireland. So this is really primed to be kind of rolled out at scale immediately. Let's say not waiting for some kind of development, but based on our experience, there's real low-hanging fruit opportunities to do this very, very quickly. And I just put in a few examples of those case studies from Europe of dairy facilities with existing ones. So here's a 90-degree facility in Switzerland at 500 kilowatts, an 85-degree facility at 1.5 megawatts in Austria, a 90 degrees for a cheese plant in Switzerland from 2018. And I always just like to highlight this one, a 90-degree supply from a factory that's been around for 11 years in a meat processing facility, just to show what kind of has been around for over a decade, lots of operating experience. And then a partner of ours did this one in Sweden. I only include it because the temperature level is higher than most others. This is one that can do up to 120 degrees in an aluminium plant, but there's no reason, let's say food and beverage or a dairy facility couldn't utilize that same solution. And it's very similar to what we're putting in the distillery towards the start of next year. So I suppose it's just to emphasize there's real projects out there. There's real conditions from the sites that we're working on every day. And there's a real history of proven capability from our European counterparts as to how this technology can work.
Thanks, David. I think that was very practical. So look, if there's Q&A, I know we've run over on time, guys, but if there's any questions, maybe unmute yourself and we can direct it to the appropriate speaker. Okay, well, look, I think that was a great talk. It took a real practical approach from SEAI, the department, Enterprise Ireland, and then from industry. So what we're really finding, and the message is that the first 50% of carbon reduction is very, very economic. Like this is sub 3-year paybacks, and there's plenty of funding options there. So it's the implementation stage we're at now, and this will help us to achieve our goals. I think from an eHeat point of view, it is important that we've some key large industries who've joined us as members. I think It'd be great to get more members in. This is a voice that needs to be heard in industry, in the government, and keep this going. Like we hear every day about hydrogen and these on the radio, which is great. But this is an immediate success story, as Fergal said on the left-hand side of his document there. These are the areas that we're going to achieve carbon reduction, and so that's it. So if there's no questions there, we'll wrap it up, and really appreciate everyone's attending and their input, and it was great. Okay.
Thanks all. Bye
Thanks
now.
all.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.